The blood-red sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Oklahoma City, Oklahoma Territory, 1885, as Yates Quinn rode in on his midnight black stallion. The mere sight of him caused conversations to halt mid-sentence and mothers to usher children indoors. Standing 6'4", with shoulders broad as an ox yoke, Yates had the kind of hard-edged face that spoke of violence without uttering a single word. A jagged scar ran from his right temple to the edge of his jaw, marking him as clearly as the notches on his well-worn Colt revolver. Lilah Novak wiped sweat from her brow as she arranged medicine bottles on the shelves of her uncle's pharmacy, unaware that her life was about to change forever. At 22, she'd lived in Oklahoma City for only 3 weeks. Having arrived from Boston after her parents' deaths, left her with no choice but to accept her uncle's offer of a home and employment. The bell above the door jingled, but Lilah didn't turn immediately, finishing her alphabetization of the tonics. "I'll be with you in just a moment," she called cheerfully. The silence that answered made her spine tingle. Lilah turned to find the shop empty of customers but filled with a palpable tension. Through the window, she watched as people scurried to the opposite side of the street, giving wide berth to a man tying his horse to the post outside. "Uncle Frederick," she called toward the back room, "I think someone's coming in." Her uncle appeared, wiping his hands on his apron, his face blanching as his eyes fixed on the window. "Yates Quinn," he whispered, voice trembling. "Stay in the back. Lilah, I'll handle this." "Who is—" The door swung open before she could finish, and the man from the street filled the door frame. Dust clung to his dark clothes, and the leather holster at his hip held a revolver that looked as natural as an extension of his arm. His face was partially obscured by the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat, but Lilah could see his eyes piercing blue, cold as winter sky, yet holding something in their depths she couldn't name. "Mr. Quinn," her uncle stammered, "what can I help you with today?" The tall cowboy's gaze shifted briefly to Lilah before returning to her uncle. He reached slowly into his vest pocket, producing a folded piece of paper which he placed on the counter without a word. Frederick adjusted his spectacles as he unfolded the note. "Medicine for Martha Jenkins. Yes, I have this prepared." He disappeared into the back room, moving with unusual haste. Lilah found herself alone with the silent stranger. The tick of the clock on the wall seemed thunderous in the quiet shop. Against her better judgment, she smiled at him. "You must be new in town as well. I've only been here 3 weeks myself." His eyes met hers, surprise flashing briefly before his expression returned to stone. He gave a barely perceptible nod. "I'm Lilah Novak," she continued, undeterred by his silence. "I came from Boston after my parents passed. It's quite different here, isn't it? The heat is something fierce compared to—" "Here it is, Mr. Quinn," Frederick interrupted, returning with a brown paper package. "Tell Mrs. Jenkins to take 1 tablespoon morning and night. That'll be 50 cents. The cowboy placed 2 quarters on the counter, took the package, and turned to leave. "Good day, Mr. Quinn," Lilah called after him. He paused at the door, his broad shoulders tensing slightly. Without turning, he touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, then disappeared into the sunlight. "Lilah," her uncle hissed, "you must never speak to that man." "Why ever not? He seemed perfectly civil." Frederick lowered his voice. "Yates Quinn is the most dangerous man in the territory. They say he's killed more men than smallpox. Gunfighter, bounty hunter. Some say he rode with Quantrill's raiders during the war. Nobody knows the whole truth, but everyone knows to stay clear." Lilah frowned. He was collecting medicine for someone named Martha. That hardly seems the action of a heartless killer. Martha Jenkins is a widow whose husband was killed in a bank robbery last year. They say Quinn tracks down the men responsible when lawmen can't or won't. But it's not justice he delivers, it's vengeance. Cold, merciless vengeance. That night, Lilah couldn't stop thinking about the silent cowboy. There had been something in his eyes, not cruelty, but pain, a depth of feeling carefully masked beneath that impassive exterior. The following day brought a thunderstorm that turned Oklahoma City's dirt streets to mud. Lilah was returning from delivering medicine to elderly Mrs. Pemberton when the skies opened. She hurried along the wooden sidewalk, clutching her shawl tightly around her shoulders, when a group of cowboys burst from the saloon, their laughter harsh and their movements unsteady from whiskey. "Well, look here, boys," one called out, blocking her path. "It's the new little filly from the pharmacy." Lilah tried to step around him. "Excuse me, I need to get back." "Not so fast, pretty lady," another said, his breath reeking of alcohol. "Why don't you come have a drink with us? We'll show you how we have fun in Oklahoma Territory." "No, thank you," Lilah said firmly, though her heart raced. "My uncle is expecting me." The first man grabbed her arm. "Your uncle can wait, we can't." Lilah struggled to free herself when suddenly the men fell silent. Over the cowboy's shoulder, she saw him, Yates Quinn, standing motionless in the rain, watching them with those ice-blue eyes. "Quinn," one of the men muttered. The grip on Lilah's arm loosened immediately. The cowboys backed away, melting back into the saloon without another word. Yates remained where he stood, water streaming from his hat, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," Lilah said, moving toward him. He gave a slight nod, then gestured toward the pharmacy with a tilt of his head, clearly offering to escort her. They walked in silence through the downpour, his tall frame providing some shelter from the rain. Outside her uncle's shop, he stopped. "Thank you again, Mr. Quinn," Lilah said, gathering her courage. "Perhaps sometime you might come in when you're not collecting medicine for others. I make a fine cup of tea, and it seems I owe you a kindness." For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps, or uncertainty. Then he touched the brim of his hat and turned away, disappearing into the rain-soaked street. Inside, her uncle was frantic. "Where have you been? You're soaked through. I was worried sick." "I'm fine, Uncle. Mr. Quinn escorted me home when some men from the saloon were being insistent." Frederick's face paled. "Yates Quinn? Again?" "Lilah, you must stay away from that man. His mere presence brings danger." "He protected me, Uncle." "A wolf might protect a lamb from other predators, but that doesn't make it safe to befriend the wolf." Days passed, and Lilah found herself watching the street for the tall, dark rider. She heard whispered stories how he'd tracked down the Barton gang after they murdered a family near Fort Smith, how he never started trouble but finished it with deadly efficiency, how he spoke so rarely that some believed him mute. One afternoon, a commotion drew everyone to the street. A stagecoach had arrived carrying the territory's circuit judge and, more significantly for the townsfolk, mail and newspapers from the east. Lilah stepped outside to watch the excitement when she spotted him across the street, leaning against a post, observing the proceedings with detached interest. Gathering her courage, she crossed to him, ignoring the stares and whispers her action provoked. "Good afternoon, Mr. Quinn," she said brightly. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" He studied her face, seeming to search for mockery or fear, and finding neither. After a moment, he nodded. "I wonder," she continued, "if you might accompany me to the general store. I have some heavy items to collect, and it would be a great help." Yates straightened, towering over her. After a moment's consideration, he offered his arm. Lilah took it, feeling the solid muscle beneath his shirt sleeve, and together they walked down the street. People stared openly, conversations halting as they passed. At the general store, the proprietor, Mr. Olson, nearly dropped a jar of pickles when they entered together. "Miss Novak," he stammered, his eyes darting nervously to her companion. "What can I help you with today?" "I've come for Uncle's order, the medical journals and those bottles of alcohol." Yes, of course." Mr. Olson hurried to gather the items, his hands trembling slightly. While they waited, Lilah noticed Yates examining a leather-bound journal on the counter. "Do you enjoy writing, Mr. Quinn?" she asked. His eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw a hint of something beyond guardedness, perhaps surprised that she would ask about his interests rather than his reputation. He nodded once. "I find writing therapeutic myself," she continued. "I keep a diary, nothing profound, just observations about life here compared to Boston. Everything is so different, yet people are fundamentally the same everywhere, don't you think?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips, gone so quickly she might have imagined it. Mr. Olson returned with her order, a heavy crate of medical journals and glass bottles. "Here you are, Miss Novak. That'll be $3.20. Lilah paid him, then looked uncertainly at the crate. "I may have been optimistic about carrying this." Without hesitation, Yates lifted the crate as though it weighed nothing. They left the store, the whispers following them like shadows. Back at the pharmacy, her uncle's face registered shock as Yates Quinn entered his establishment for the second time in a week, this time with his niece. "Thank you for your help, Mr. Quinn," Lilah said as he set the crate down carefully. "Won't you stay for that tea I mentioned?" Frederick looked as though he might faint, but before he could object, the bell above the door rang again. Sheriff Miller entered, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his pistol when he saw Yates. "Quinn," the sheriff acknowledged stiffly. "Didn't know you were back in town." Yates nodded in response. "Got word the Slater brothers might be heading this way," Miller continued, watching Yates carefully. "Thought you should know, considering your history with them." Something dark passed over Yates's face, the first real emotion Lilah had seen him display. He nodded again, more curtly this time, then turned to leave. "Mr. Quinn," Lilah called after him, "the tea offer stands. Any time." He paused at the door, touching his hat brim to her before exiting. Sheriff Miller frowned. "Miss Novak, I don't mean to overstep, but that man is dangerous company." "So everyone keeps telling me, Sheriff, yet he's shown me nothing but courtesy." "A rattlesnake can be quiet too, right before it strikes. Those Slater brothers I mentioned? They're the last of a gang that killed Quinn's family 10 years back. His wife and daughter." Lilah felt her heart constrict. "His family?" "Homestead outside of Kansas City. Quinn was away when it happened. Been hunting down the responsible parties ever since. That's why he doesn't talk much, they say. Made some kind of vow of silence until he finished his vengeance." That night, unable to sleep, Lilah sat by her window watching the street below. A figure emerged from the shadows, Yates, walking purposefully toward the livery stable. Minutes later, he rode out of town, his black stallion a shadow against the night sky. 3 days passed with no sign of him. On the fourth morning, Lilah was arranging a display of patent medicines when the bell jingled. Sheriff Miller entered, his expression grim. "Miss Novak, is your uncle available? Got some injured men need tending." "Who's hurt?" she asked, already gathering bandages. "Posse that went after the Slater brothers. We caught up with them at a line cabin near the Cimarron. There was shooting." "The Slaters?" "Both dead." Miller hesitated. "Quinn got there before us. Found him standing over their bodies, 6 empty chambers in his Colt. Wouldn't say a word, just rode away." Lilah's uncle emerged from the back room, and the men left to tend the wounded posse members. She continued her work mechanically, her thoughts with the silent cowboy who had finally completed his decade-long quest for vengeance. What would become of him now? Late that afternoon, as golden light slanted through the shop windows, the bell rang again. Yates Quinn stood in the doorway, his clothes dusty from the trail, his face bearing a fresh cut along the cheekbone. His eyes found hers immediately. "Mr. Quinn," she said softly, "I heard what happened." He nodded, exhaustion evident in the slump of his shoulders. "Let me tend that cut," she offered, gesturing to a chair behind the counter. To her surprise, he complied, sinking onto the wooden seat as though his legs could no longer support him. Lilah worked in silence, cleaning the wound gently. This close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair at the temples. He wasn't as old as she'd first thought, perhaps 35, but life had carved its hardships into his features. "Sheriff Miller told me about your family," she said quietly as she applied a salve to the cut. "I'm sorry for your loss." His eyes closed briefly, pain washing over his face. When he opened them again, they were filled with a weariness that transcended physical exhaustion. "It's finished now," she continued. "The men who hurt them are gone." Yates reached slowly into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. He handed it to her, his fingers calloused against her smooth skin. Lilah unfolded the note, reading the carefully penned words. "Would you still offer that tea?" Her heart quickened. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, of course." She closed the pharmacy early that day, hanging the closed sign with trembling fingers. In her uncle's kitchen, she brewed the promised tea, adding honey the way her mother had taught her. Yates sat at the table, his large frame making the kitchen furniture seem diminutive. "My uncle won't be pleased," she said, placing a steaming cup before him. "He thinks you're dangerous." Yates took a piece of paper from his pocket and wrote, "He's right. Because of what you've done? Or what you might do?" "Both. I've killed men. I'm not proud of it. For revenge, for justice, and after today, never again." His handwriting was surprisingly elegant, each letter carefully formed. It struck her that this method of communication required thought, precision, the opposite of the quick-tempered gunfighter people feared. "You took a vow of silence," she said, "until you found them all." He nodded, then wrote, 10 years, 4 months, 18 days. "Will you speak now?" He hesitated, then wrote, "Not sure I remember how." Lilah smiled. "I imagine it's like riding a horse. The body remembers." She reached across the table and touched his hand lightly. "I'd like to hear your voice someday when you're ready." That evening marked the beginning of something neither could have anticipated. Each day, Yates would appear at the pharmacy, sometimes bringing small gifts, wildflowers, a piece of quartz that caught the sunlight, once a book of poetry he'd found at the general store. They would walk together, Lilah talking enough for both of them, Yates responding with nods, gestures, or written notes. The townspeople watched with a mixture of fascination and horror. Gossip spread the educated Eastern girl and the notorious gunfighter. Women whispered behind fans, men shook their heads in disbelief. Lilah Novak made his disapproval abundantly clear. "He's a killer, Lilah," he argued one night after Yates had escorted her home. "A man with blood on his hands." "He's a man who protected his family the only way he knew how," she countered. "What would you have done if someone harmed Mother or me?" "That's different." "Is it?" "The law failed him, Uncle. When authorities couldn't bring his family's murderers to justice, he took on that burden himself. And now? What purpose does he have now that his revenge is complete?" It was a question Lilah had been asking herself. What would become of Yates Quinn, a man who had defined himself by a single purpose for over a decade? The answer began to emerge in small ways. Yates started taking odd jobs around town, mending fences at the livery stable, helping the blacksmith with difficult horses, even assisting elderly Mrs. Pemberton with repairs to her roof. He still didn't speak, but his presence became less threatening as people witnessed his quiet competence. One evening in late summer, they sat on a hillside overlooking the town, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. "I received a letter from a medical college in St. Louis today," Lilah said, plucking a blade of grass. "They're accepting women students now. I applied months ago before leaving Boston." Yates looked at her, his expression questioning. "I've always wanted to be a doctor," she explained. "My father encouraged it, though most thought it inappropriate for a woman. The term begins in October." He took out his notepad and wrote, "You should go. You'd make a fine doctor. Would you consider coming with me?" The words tumbled out before she could reconsider them. "St. Louis is a big city. You could start fresh where no one knows your past." Surprise registered on his face, followed by something that looked like hope, quickly masked. He wrote, "Why would you want that?" Lilah gathered her courage. "Because I've grown to care for you, Yates. More than care. I know it seems impossible we're so different, and you haven't even spoken to me. But I see who you are beneath the silence and the reputation. I see a man of principle and depth." He stared at her, wonder and disbelief warring in his eyes. Slowly, he wrote, "I don't deserve you." "That isn't for you to decide," she said firmly. "I choose my own path, and I'm choosing you if you'll have me." Yates set down his pencil and paper. He looked out over the town, then back to her face. His hand, calloused from years of hard living, reached for hers with incredible gentleness. Then, in a voice rough from disuse, barely above a whisper, he spoke his first words in over 10 years. Yes. The single word hung in the air between them, more powerful than any lengthy declaration. Lilah's eyes filled with tears as she squeezed his hand. "Say something else," she whispered. He swallowed hard. "Lilah." Her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. She moved closer, and he hesitantly wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Together they watched darkness claim the land, the first stars appearing in the deepening blue. "I need to tell you everything," he said, each word emerging with effort. "About them, about what I did. Then you can decide." "Tomorrow," she said. "Tell me tomorrow." That night, a fierce summer storm swept through Oklahoma City. Lightning split the sky as Lilah lay awake, thinking of Yates's voice, how it matched him perfectly deep, with a roughness that spoke of hardship, yet gentle in its delivery. A crash from downstairs startled her. She grabbed her robe, thinking perhaps the wind had broken a window. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, voices came from the pharmacy, angry, unfamiliar voices. "Where's the money, old man? We know you keep it in here." "Please," she heard her uncle beg. "Take what's in the register. There's nothing else." Lilah froze, her heart pounding. Robbery. She should run for help, but that would mean leaving her uncle alone with the thieves. Carefully, she peered around the doorframe. 2 men in rain-soaked clothes had Frederick cornered behind the counter. One held a knife to his throat while the other ransacked the register. "This ain't enough," the second man growled, pocketing the meager takings. "Where's the rest? The safe? The strong box?" "There isn't any more," Frederick insisted. "Business has been slow." The first man pressed the knife harder. "Maybe we should cut you a bit, see if that improves your memory." Lilah gasped involuntarily, drawing their attention. "Well, look here," the second man said with a cruel smile. "The pretty niece I've heard about. Come on in, darlin'. Join the party." Mind racing, Lilah stepped into the room. "Let my uncle go. He's telling the truth. We don't keep much money here." "Then we'll have to find other compensation," the knife wielder said, his eyes traveling over her in a way that made her skin crawl. A tremendous crash shattered the night as the front door burst open. Yates Quinn stood in the doorway, rain cascading from his hat and coat, his revolver already drawn. "Quinn!" the second robber exclaimed, recognition and fear in his voice. "They said you left town." Yates's eyes were cold as he assessed the situation. "Let them go," he said, his voice low and dangerous. The robbers exchanged glances, calculating their odds. The one holding Frederick shoved him roughly aside, brandishing his knife toward Yates. "There's 2 of us, Quinn. You might get one, but not both." In a movement so swift it seemed impossible, Yates fired. The knife went flying, along with several of the robber's fingers. The man howled in pain as his companion scrambled for his own weapon. Yates kicked the second man's gun away before he could draw it fully, then struck him with the butt of his revolver. The robber crumpled to the floor, unconscious. "Sheriff's coming," Yates said, nodding toward the street where lanterns were already visible through the rain-streaked windows. "Heard the commotion from my room at the hotel." Lilah rushed to her uncle, who was shaken but unharmed. "Uncle Frederick, are you all right?" He nodded, looking from her to Yates with new understanding in his eyes. Sheriff Miller arrived with 2 deputies surveying the scene with raised eyebrows. "Well, Quinn, seems you've delivered more justice tonight. These 2 are wanted for a string of robberies across 3 counties. As the deputies dragged the cursing, wounded robber and his unconscious partner away, Miller turned to Frederick. "You were lucky Quinn was nearby, Novak." Frederick straightened his spectacles. "Yes," he said slowly. "Very fortunate indeed." He extended his hand to Yates. "Thank you. I believe I've misjudged you, Mr. Quinn." Yates accepted the handshake, nodding once. After the sheriff left, Frederick surprised them both. "It's late, and this storm isn't letting up. Mr. Quinn, I think it best if you stay here tonight. We have a spare room upstairs." Lilah smiled at her uncle, gratitude in her eyes. It was a small step, but a significant one. The following morning dawned clear and bright. as though the storm had washed the world clean. Lilah found Yates on the back porch, watching the sunrise. He turned at her approach, his face softening in a way reserved only for her. "Good morning," she said, joining him at the railing. "Morning?" His voice was stronger today, more confident. "You promised to tell me everything." He nodded, looking out over the glistening wet landscape. "After the war, I bought land near Kansas City, built a home for my wife, Sarah. We had a daughter, Emma." His words came slowly, each one weighted with memory. "I traveled sometimes, selling horses I'd trained. One trip, I came home to find them." He stopped, his knuckles white on the porch railing. Lilah placed her hand over his. "You don't have to." "I do. You need to know who I am." He drew a deep breath. 8 men, the Slater gang. They'd robbed a bank in town, needed a place to hide. They found our farm. Sarah, she would have helped anyone in need, given them food, shelter. Instead, He closed his eyes. Emma was 6 years old. Tears slid silently down Lilah's cheeks. "I'm so sorry, Yates. I buried them on the hill behind our house where Emma liked to pick wildflowers. Then I made a vow not to speak again until I'd found every man responsible. I learned to track, to shoot better than I already could. Became someone else. Someone hard. You became what you needed to be. A killer." He turned to face her fully. "The men last night would have been numbers 33 and 34 if I hadn't promised myself no more death after the Slaters. You saved us without killing. This time," his blue eyes searched her face. "But violence has been my companion for so long, Lilah. I'm not sure I know how to live without it, how to be the man you deserve." She reached up to touch his scarred cheek. "The man I love is the one standing before me now with all his past, all his pain. I don't want some imaginary perfect man. I want you, Yates Quinn." He covered her hand with his own, turning his face to press a kiss to her palm. "I love you," he said, the words rusty but heartfelt. "Never thought I'd say that to anyone again." "Say it as often as you like," she smiled through her tears. "I'll never tire of hearing it." 3 weeks later, Lilah Novak and Yates Quinn were married in a small ceremony in her uncle's parlor. The town buzzed with the news, many disapproving, some merely curious, but a few those whose lives Yates had quietly touched during his time in Oklahoma City genuinely supportive. The day after the wedding, they boarded the eastbound train for St. Louis, Yates carrying their luggage, Lilah clutching her acceptance letter to the medical college. As the train pulled away from the station, she looked up at her husband's profile against the window. "Nervous?" she asked. He considered this, then shook his head. "Not with you beside me." His words came easier now, though he remained a man of few of them. "You're the bravest person I've ever known, Lilah Quinn." "Me?" she laughed. "I'm not the one who faced down outlaws." "Courage isn't just about facing guns," he said thoughtfully. "It's about facing life. Taking chances when everyone tells you not to. You did that with me." She rested her head against his shoulder. "Because I saw you, Yates. Not the legend, not the gunfighter you." He kissed the top of her head. "And I'm only beginning to discover who that might be." St. Louis in 1885 was a city of contrasts, elegant mansions alongside teeming tenements, grand boulevards intersecting with muddy alleys. They found lodging in a modest boarding house run by a widow who didn't ask questions about Yates's scarred face or his tendency toward silence. While Lilah attended medical lectures, Yates found work at the riverfront, his strength and horsemanship valued by merchants moving goods. In the evenings, they would sit in their small rooms, Lilah sharing what she had learned, Yates listening intently, occasionally asking questions that revealed his natural intelligence. Gradually, he began to speak more, especially when they were alone. He told her stories of his childhood in Tennessee, of his parents who died in a cholera epidemic, of the war years he tried to forget. In turn, she shared memories of her genteel Boston upbringing, her father's progressive ideas about women's education, her mother's quiet strength. Their life wasn't without challenges. Yates still woke sometimes in the night, sweat-soaked and reaching for a weapon that was no longer under his pillow. Occasionally, men from his past would recognize him on the street, leading to tense moments that he now walked away from rather than escalated. Lilah faced skepticism and outright hostility from male classmates and professors who believed medicine no place for a woman. But together, they weathered each storm. Yates's nightmares became less frequent. Lilah's determination earned her grudging respect at the college. They built a life, brick by brick, day by day. In the spring of 1887, Lilah discovered she was expecting a child. Yates received the news with a mixture of joy and terror. "I don't know if I can be a father again," he confessed one night, his voice barely audible in their darkened bedroom. "What if I fail this child like I failed Emma?" Lilah took his face between her hands. "You didn't fail her, Yates. You weren't there because you were providing for your family. What happened was evil, pure, and simple, but it wasn't your failing. I should have been there to protect them. And then there would have been 3 graves on that hillside instead of 2, she said firmly. You survived so you could continue their story, and now we're writing a new chapter together." In November 1887, their son was born, a healthy boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined spirit. They named him Frederick Thomas Quinn, honoring both Lilah's uncle and Yates's father. Little Freddie became the center of their world. Yates, who had once been feared by men across the territory, now spent hours patiently rocking his son to sleep, telling him stories in the low, gentle voice that was becoming more natural with each passing day. Lilah completed her medical studies in 1889, one of only 3 women in her graduating class. She found a position with a charity hospital that served the city's poorest residents, while Yates, with savings from his riverfront work and some careful investments, opened a small livery stable. They moved from their boarding house to a modest home on the city's western edge, where Freddie could have a yard to play in and Yates could keep a few horses. They planted a garden together, Yates teaching Lilah what he knew about coaxing life from the soil. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching 3-year-old Freddie chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, Lilah noticed her husband's thoughtful expression. "What is it?" she asked, reaching for his hand. "I got a letter today," he said, "from Sheriff Miller in Oklahoma City." Lilah felt a flutter of concern. "Bad news?" "No, an offer. They need a new deputy. Miller's getting older, thinking about retirement. Says he'd like someone who knows the difference between law and justice." "He wants you?" Lilah was surprised. "After your history?" Yates nodded. "Says that's precisely why. I've seen both sides, lived outside the law and within it. He thinks I'd be fair." "How do you feel about it?" He was silent for a long moment, watching his son's laughter as he cupped a glowing firefly in his small hands. "Never thought I'd wear a badge. Never thought I'd be a husband or father again either." He squeezed her hand. "But Oklahoma's changing. It'll be a state soon. New laws, new beginnings. Maybe there's poetry in returning to help build something after spending so long tearing down. Would you want to go back, after everything? Not without you and Freddie. You're a doctor now, with patients who need you. Your work matters." "There are sick people in Oklahoma Territory too," she said thoughtfully, "and fewer doctors to tend them." They discussed it for weeks. The risks, the opportunities, the symmetry of returning to where their story began. In the end, they decided together. By summer's end, they had sold their St. Louis home and packed their belongings for the journey west. Oklahoma City had grown in their absence. New buildings lined streets that were now properly graded. The railroad had brought prosperity and population. But when they stepped off the train, there was one familiar face waiting for them, Frederick Novak, older now but beaming with pride at the sight of his niece, her husband, and the grandson named for him. "Welcome home," he said, embracing Lilah. He extended his hand to Yates, who took it warmly. "Sheriff Miller's been telling everyone his new deputy is the most feared gunman in the territory's history. Half the town is terrified, the other half curious." "And you, Uncle?" Lilah asked. "What have you been telling them?" Frederick smiled, bending to lift young Freddie into his arms. That they're about to meet the real Yates Quinn, not the legend, but the man, and that they'll be better for it. They settled into a house not far from Frederick's pharmacy. Yates pinned on the deputy's badge with solemn purpose, while Lilah established a medical practice that quickly became essential to the community. Young Freddie thrived in the open spaces of the territory, developing his father's affinity for horses and his mother's compassion for others. Years passed. Oklahoma achieved statehood in 1907. Yates eventually became sheriff when Miller retired, serving with a quiet integrity that earned him respect rather than fear. Lilah's practice expanded to include a small hospital where she trained nurses and midwives. They had 2 more children, a daughter, Sarah, named for Yates's first wife, and another son, James. The legend of the silent killer faded, replaced by stories of the taciturn but fair sheriff who could calm a situation with a look, who taught young men to solve disputes without violence, who knew when to enforce the letter of the law and when to honor its spirit. On their 25th wedding anniversary in 1910, the citizens of Oklahoma City held a celebration in their honor. As Lilah and Yates stood together, surrounded by their children, her uncle, and hundreds of well-wishers, Mayor Thompson raised a toast. "To Sheriff and Dr. Quinn, who have healed our bodies and kept our peace for 2 decades, Oklahoma City is blessed to call you our own." Later that night, as they walked home under a canopy of stars, Yates stopped and drew Lilah into his arms. "Did you ever imagine this?" he asked, gesturing to the thriving town around them. "That first day in your uncle's shop when I couldn't even speak to you?" "No," she admitted, smiling up at him, "but I knew there was more to you than others could see." "You gave me my voice back," he said softly, "and with it, my life." "We gave each other a future," she corrected him, "one neither of us could have had alone." As they continued home, arm in arm, Lilah thought of the journey that had brought them here from a dusty pharmacy counter to this moment of contentment. The silent, scarred cowboy who had struck fear into the hearts of outlaws across the territory had found his greatest strength not in the weapon at his hip, but in the capacity of his heart to love again. And she, the Boston girl seeking a fresh start, had found courage she never knew she possessed in loving a man others feared to approach. They reached their front porch, where the lamp burned welcomingly in the window. Inside, their children slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that their parents' love, improbable, hard-won, and enduring, had created a home where silence had given way to the symphony of family life. Yates held the door for his wife, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners with the smile that was now familiar to all who knew him. "After you, Dr. Quinn." "Thank you, Sheriff," she replied with the same warm affection that had sustained them through a quarter-century together. Hand in hand, they stepped inside, closing the door on the whispers of the past and embracing the comfortable silence of a love that needed no words to be understood.